You wake up in a haystuff cot. The mattress smells like betrayal, mildew, and centuries of crushed dreams. There's straw poking through your blanket, which is made from something that may have once been wool, but now mostly resembles sadness and sheep regret. You're somewhere in rural 13th century Europe. You don't know where exactly, because maps are basically witchcraft and you never learned to read anyway. Outside, there's the sound of a rooster having a nervous breakdown. You think, for a brief moment, that you might be dead. Then you realize, no, you're still alive. Unfortunately. You rub your eyes. The sun is out. Mostly. There's something off about it. The light feels wrong, like the world forgot how to color inside the lines. And then it hits you, people are screaming. Always a great sign in the Middle Ages. Dogs are barking, cows are mooing, someone is hitting a church bell with what sounds like a boot, and your neighbor is howling Latin prayers with the enthusiasm of someone who just saw Satan moonwalking across the sky. A child runs past your window shouting, "It's eating the sun." You're not sure what it is, but you know one thing for certain, it probably doesn't have good intentions. This, dear listener, is a solar eclipse. And in the Middle Ages, that meant you were absolutely, unquestionably, about to die. Or your crops were. Or your king. Or your soul. Depends on who you ask. So before you get comfortable, because yes, we're going to be here a while, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's lying in bed listening to me rant about goat blood and medieval panic while trying to fall asleep. Seriously, I love it. Also, if you hear snoring halfway through, that's probably me. Alright, let's set the stage. The Middle Ages, that charming slice of European history roughly spanning 500 to 1500 CE, was a time when medical professionals prescribed crushed emeralds for stomach pain, and people believed that spontaneous human combustion was just a thing that happened if you were too sinful or too flammable. Science was mostly illegal. Questioning authority was punishable by a public spanking, or worse, church. So naturally, when the moon suddenly decided to cover the sun, it was not interpreted as a predictable cosmic event. No, it was divine rage, celestial punishment, a sky demon in a snacking mood, possibly the beginning of the apocalypse, or just a strongly worded celestial warning. And if you were really lucky, all of the above. Eclipses were terrifying. You don't have access to NASA, telescopes, or the internet. There's no notification on your iPhone saying, "Hey, heads up, eclipse tomorrow." You just wake up, and the sun is gone like it got fired from the sky for inappropriate behavior. And because most people in medieval Europe couldn't read, and even if they could, the books were mostly chained to monasteries and written in Latin, knowledge about astronomy was kept under tight ecclesiastical lockdown. The few people who did understand eclipses, educated monks, traveling scholars, maybe one weird guy in a tower with a collection of sandtimers and anxiety, were generally ignored or burned as heretics depending on the mood of the town that day. You, a medieval peasant, are not concerned with orbital mechanics. You're concerned that the sun, the literal provider of light, warmth, and moral stability, is being devoured by some sky beast with digestion issues. And because everyone else is also panicking, the hysteria becomes a group activity. Some people fall to their knees in prayer. Others start flagellating, which is a fancy historical way of saying they whip themselves in the back while shouting apologies to Jesus. The town priest, drunk on mead and existential dread, is swinging a Thursdayable of incense so aggressively it's basically a medieval rave. And then, of course, comes the yelling. This isn't your regular yelling. This is apocalypse yelling. The kind that implies you've done something so cosmically offensive that even the sun has decided to pack its bags and go. One guy blames the Jews. Another blames the women. A third man blames a goat with a suspicious look. You know, typical scapegoating. In England, someone might be screaming that it's a warning from God about the king. In France, it's probably blamed on the English. In Germany, it might be witches. In Italy, everyone blames the Pope, the devil, or both, depending on the political climate that morning. In Iceland, interestingly enough, someone might run outside shouting, "It's the wolf again," referring to the mythological creature Skoll, a giant wolf that chases the sun through the sky. When Skoll catches it, boom, solar eclipse. So you might see people out there banging pots and pans, trying to scare the wolf away with clamor. Not super scientific, but hey, it beats doing nothing. Let's slow down here for a moment, because I can feel you trying to drift off already. That's good. That means we're doing this right. Picture yourself standing in a field. The world is unnaturally dark. Not nighttime dark, more like apocalypse o'clock dark. The birds have gone silent. The livestock are acting weird. A chicken just laid an egg and immediately regrets it. And the color of everything has shifted. The sky is gray. The shadows are long and strange. It's cold. The temperature has dropped. You feel it in your bones, like the air just got scared too. You look up and see it, a black disk where the sun used to be. A glowing corona. No, not the beer, the plasma, rings the moon in eerie firelight. Your heart stutters. Your instincts scream run, but there's nowhere to go. The sky has betrayed you. The heavens are malfunctioning. Something big is happening. You are a speck of dirt with anxiety. You're also wearing a wool tunic that hasn't been washed in 3 months. Your shoes are made from cow intestines, and your teeth are basically decorative at this point. So frankly, you're too uncomfortable to process celestial terror properly. You settle for wide-eyed panic and hope that someone else figures out how to stop the sun from being eaten. But here's the thing. While the general public believed eclipses were divine omens, the elite, monarchs, scholars, court astrologers saw them as political signs. Especially bad ones. To a medieval king, an eclipse wasn't just the sky being dramatic. It was a sign that something bad was coming. A war. A death. A betrayal. If you were in power, eclipses were like unsolicited performance reviews from God. Dear King, you're doing a terrible job. Sincerely, the Sun. Astrologers, who were a mix of scientists, mystics, and professional guessers, would analyze eclipses in painstaking detail. What constellation it occurred in, what planet it aligned with, what color the moon turned, how many goats screamed that day. All to produce forecasts like, the king may die, or there will be great pestilence in the north, or avoid buying bread this week. And people listen to them. Because nothing says credibility like a man with a robe and an oversized hourglass muttering in Latin. So if you're a royal, you probably summon your astrologer immediately after the eclipse. You need answers. What did it mean? Who's trying to kill you? Was it the Duke of Arrogance again? You never liked him. He smells like fish and ambition. Meanwhile, your peasants are outside sacrificing a goat or lighting a big fire or dancing in circles while sobbing into their elbows. Someone has probably proposed a human sacrifice, but thankfully the village priest talked them down by suggesting an extra-long sermon instead. Lucky you. Let's not forget Asia. While our medieval European friends are busy panicking, China has a long tradition of recording eclipses with startling precision. In fact, they were writing about them as far back as 2134 BCE, earlier than the pyramids. Court astronomers tracked celestial events and were expected to predict eclipses. Failure to do so could result in execution or at least a very uncomfortable conversation with the emperor. And what did they believe was causing eclipses? A sky dragon. Of course. You don't mess with celestial dragons. The Chinese would bang drums, set off fireworks, and generally create a massive ruckus to scare the dragon away. Because nothing says "don't eat our sun" like a synchronized drumline. In India, eclipses were often linked to the demon Rahu, who was decapitated by Vishnu and whose disembodied head occasionally swallows the sun or moon. It's a beautiful myth, with just enough cosmic gore to keep things exciting. But back in Europe, where you currently live, no such nuance exists. If something bad happens in the sky, it's either divine judgment or witchcraft. Usually both. And if you're a woman with a mole in the wrong place, congratulations. You might be accused of causing the eclipse with your very suspicious presence and possibly burned for it. At this point, the eclipse ends. The sun returns. Birds resume chirping. Chickens resume laying guilt-ridden eggs. And everyone collectively decides that whatever horrible thing could have happened has been averted. For now. There's a feast. Or at least some barley mush, which is kind of the same thing in the Middle Ages. People celebrate. They say things like, "Thank God it's over," and "that was definitely the Jews' fault," and "next time, let's sacrifice a bigger goat." You go back to your straw bed. You've survived the eclipse. You smell like fear and mutton. You're exhausted. You don't know it yet, but in exactly 7 months, another eclipse is coming. And this time, you're pretty sure it's personal. You wake up again, still in your itchy straw mattress, still in a world with no running water, and still vaguely smelling like boiled cabbage and unresolved trauma. But today, something is different. Again. This time, it's nighttime. You remember because you just tripped over a bucket of something unspeakable while stumbling out to use the bathroom, which is a generous term for a hole in the ground that may or may not be full of regret and worms. The moon is supposed to be out, casting its pale, ghostly light over your mud and suffering-infused village. But it isn't. Instead, there's a terrifying reddish shadow in the sky where the moon should be. You pause, bucket still attached to your foot, and stare upward in medieval confusion. "Oh no," you whisper. "It's happening again." Yes, it's a lunar eclipse. And congratulations, you're now witnessing yet another cosmic event that will 100% be blamed on you, your neighbors, and probably the horse that kicked the bishop last week. Unlike the solar eclipse, which was more dramatic but shorter, lunar eclipses last longer, giving your local population plenty of time to freak out, organize some apocalyptic rituals, and accuse someone of summoning the devil via soup ingredients. You hear footsteps. A mob is forming. There's chanting. Someone's ringing a bell that sounds suspiciously like a stolen pot. A baby is crying. The town drunk is already shirtless and waving a wooden spoon like a weapon. Things are escalating. Now, to you, a peasant with zero access to scientific literacy, formal education, or even functional shoes, the moon turning red is not a poetic moment. It's not a wow, the universe is beautiful type of night. No, it's clearly the blood moon. An omen of war, famine, betrayal, or, worst of all, tax collection. The red color especially gets people going. A regular lunar eclipse is scary, sure. But when the moon turns the color of fresh pig guts, that's when you know things are about to go full book of Revelation. Let's talk about that color. You and I, in the cozy knowledge cocoon of the future, know it's caused by Earth's atmosphere bending and filtering the sunlight that wraps around the planet, casting red light on the moon during totality. It's a beautiful optical phenomenon. But to a medieval European villager, it's blood. Literal sky blood. From the moon. You assume someone up there got stabbed. Or worse, the moon itself is bleeding. Why? Probably because someone in the next village married their cousin again, and the gods are sick of it. You clutch your cloak tighter. The air is cold. Colder than it should be. You hear murmurs of war is coming, God is angry, and I told you not to plant the cabbage that close to the cemetery. Panic, as always, is a group project. Somewhere, someone is already preparing a sermon. Others are grabbing iron tools, garlic, or fragments of the true cross, which, suspiciously, every village seems to have a piece of. Your job? Don't die. Also maybe hide your chickens. In case you were wondering, there were actual documented accounts of this kind of lunar chaos. Take the year 1133. A total eclipse of the moon occurred, and people absolutely lost their collective medieval minds. Chroniclers recorded that it turned the moon the color of blood, which could only mean one thing. King Henry I of England was about to die. And wouldn't you know it? He did. A few months later. Coincidence? Probably. But in medieval logic? Solid proof. The moon clearly knew something. Now, you might be wondering, were there any rational thinkers in this dark tapestry of lunar paranoia? Well, yes. Kind of. Depending on how you define rational. Islamic astronomers, for example, had a fairly accurate understanding of eclipses by the 9th century. Scholars like al-Battani and al-Zarqali used math, geometry, and instruments that looked like torture devices but were actually astrolabes to predict lunar eclipses with stunning accuracy. But again, that was in places like Baghdad, Cordoba, and Cairo. Meanwhile, in your muddy little village in southern France or Kent or lower Overtherland, you still think the moon turns red when the devil's in heat. And even when someone does come along with a better explanation, say, a wandering scholar or a monk who read one too many Greek scrolls, he's more likely to be labeled a heretic than believed. You can't just say the Earth's shadow is blocking the moon in public. That sounds suspiciously like wizard talk. Better to nod, pretend it's the wrath of Saint Agatha, and keep your heresy-free kneecaps intact. Let's pause a second. Take a breath. Inhale the scent of wet thatch, old onions, and horse sweat. Let the soothing sound of distant screaming lull you into a nice relaxed state. Imagine the clouds drifting across the sky, momentarily covering the demonic blood orb that's currently haunting your village nightscape. You are safe. For now. Unless the priest sees you not praying. Then you're definitely getting guilt-flogged. Now, while Europe was losing its mind under the angry red moon, let's check in with the Aztecs. Because, oh boy, they had feelings about lunar eclipses. In Aztec mythology, the moon goddess Calzocui, whose name you absolutely will not pronounce correctly while falling asleep, was dismembered by her brother, the sun god Huitzilopochtli. A lunar eclipse? That was her getting eaten or attacked again. Some Aztecs believed if you stared directly at the eclipse, you could go blind. Pregnant women were told to stay inside, wear obsidian blades on their heads, or hold amulets to prevent their babies from being born with deformities. And if you were in charge of appeasing the gods, you probably had to cut out a heart or two. You know, just to be safe. Back in India, again we have Rahu, the demon who tries to devour the moon whenever he's having a bad day. During eclipses, people would stay indoors, fast, bathe afterward, and sometimes chant prayers from sunrise to sunset. It was considered a time of impurity, like the moon needed a good cleansing after being mouth-handled by a demon head. Even in Japan, some regions believed that water became poisonous during an eclipse. Lakes, wells, and rivers? Off limits. You want to drink during a lunar eclipse? Good luck with your cursed internal organs. Meanwhile, you, in your European peasant hovel, are having a whole different crisis. Because your neighbor just blamed you for the blood moon. Why? Because last week you sneezed during Mass, and everyone knows that's how witches mark their targets. You try to protest, but your voice is drowned out by the sound of someone lighting a torch. The priest intervenes. Not because he believes you, but because he wants to turn the occasion into a donation opportunity. Give more silver, he says, and God might unbleed the moon. You don't have silver. You have barley and a weird rash. So you offer that. He declines. By now, the eclipse is waning. The red hue fades. The moon slowly returns to normal. The crowd exhales in collective relief, as if they personally fought off the demon with prayer and high-pitched screaming. You survive. Again. Mostly. The next day, the village returns to its normal routine, subsistence farming, spiritual anxiety, and intense body odor. No one really talks about what happened. The priest declares that the faithful protected the land, and the tax collector raises your tithes just in case God wants a bonus. You, still itchy and spiritually traumatized, go back to tending turnips. The world didn't end. But it might next time. So keep your head down. And for heaven's sake, don't sneeze again. Let your eyes drift closed now. Picture the moon, calm, silent, pale. No blood. No screaming. Just a quiet hum of celestial indifference. Because in the Middle Ages, even the sky had attitude. You wake up again. And no, it's not a new day. Not really. Because time, in the medieval world, is less of a linear progression, and more like a sweaty, hay-scented fever dream punctuated by blisters, questionable porridge, and unholy amounts of superstition. This time, you're not in a panic. Not yet. You're at the market, which is a generous term for what is essentially a patch of dirt, a dozen shrieking hens, and at least one man yelling about radishes with a suspicious amount of emotional intensity. You're here not to shop, but to observe a local noble being pelted with turnips. Why? Because last week he paid an astrologer to predict a favorable lunar conjunction, and instead, the town well exploded and a pig gave birth to something with 5 legs. So yes, you're about to learn the most dangerous game of the Middle Ages, public astrology. Because if you thought eclipses were just sky events, you're wrong. So wrong. In fact, to most people during this time, eclipses weren't just terrifying celestial omens, they were also full-blown personality quizzes from a cosmos. And you, unfortunately, are being graded. So before we unravel this deeply unfortunate chapter of history, take a moment, as tradition demands, to pause, breathe, and, do the YouTube thing. Like this video if you're somehow still awake and entertained by medieval sky trauma. Subscribe if you genuinely enjoy this weird hybrid of comedy, suffering, and obscure lunar folklore. And let me know in the comments, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it over there? Because there is something wonderfully cozy about knowing someone in Wisconsin is listening to 13th century eclipse anxiety at 2:37 a.m. while eating cold cereal. I salute you. Now, back to your local market disaster. Let's start with a bold medieval claim. Eclipses influence kings, empires, and your personal chances of dying in a ditch. Medieval astrologers were very into this idea. They took the Greek and Roman traditions, blended them with Arabic astronomy, and then marinated it all in biblical guilt until the result resembled horoscopes written by someone who's both terrified of sin and very enthusiastic about planetary geometry. The belief was simple: eclipses signaled coming disasters. But not just vague disasters. Specific ones. Deaths of kings, famines, plagues, wars, political scandals. Tuesday. Astrologers would use complicated charts called ephemerides, which sounds like a skin condition but is actually a calendar of celestial movements, to figure out what an eclipse meant. Was it happening in Aries? That's a sign of war. In Pisces? Floods. In Leo? A king will fall, or at the very least stub his toe in a meaningful way. If you were a ruler, you definitely hired one of these guys. Not because you believed in astrology, okay, maybe you did, but because everyone else did, and if you didn't act appropriately panic during an eclipse, people might assume you were the bad omen. Some rulers took this very seriously. In 1185, King Baldwin IV of Jerusalem reportedly died shortly after an eclipse, fulfilling the astrologer's predictions to the satisfaction of everyone except Baldwin. He probably had other opinions on the matter. And in 1133, remember this one? A lunar eclipse occurred just before King Henry I of England died. That's two monarchs, both conveniently dying post-eclipse. Statistically suspicious? Maybe. Proof that the moon has a vendetta against royalty? Absolutely. And then there's Louis of Bavaria. In the 14th century, an eclipse occurred shortly before he attempted to march into Italy to claim imperial power. The Pope, seizing the opportunity, declared that the eclipse was proof that God did not approve. Louis marched anyway, got excommunicated, and had to crawl his way through a minefield of papal sarcasm and ecclesiastical side-eye. But astrology wasn't just for kings. Oh no. The peasants got a dose too, whether they asked for it or not. A wandering astrologer might show up at your town square, mutter something about Saturn being in retrograde, and then confidently declare that your village would soon be cursed with frogs, fire, or the arrival of another tax collector. Naturally, this would cause mass hysteria, a small bonfire, and at least one unjust goat sacrifice. Did the predictions come true? Sometimes. But only because the predictions were always bad. If you say a disaster is coming, and wait long enough, medieval Europe will absolutely deliver. There's a plague every decade, a famine every season, and war roughly every second Tuesday. So, win-win for the astrologer. Now, you might ask, were there skeptics? Rational thinkers? Quiet voices in the mud screaming, maybe the moon isn't trying to kill us. Yes, a few. Some church officials actually opposed astrology. They viewed it as dangerously close to divination, which, in Christian theology, is one slow exhale away from Satan's party tricks. St. Augustine, for example, was famously skeptical. He argued that it made no sense to blame the stars for your actions. Which, let's be honest, is a surprisingly modern opinion for a man who also believed babies were born sinful and wet nurses needed moral supervision. But despite the church's official suspicion, astrology was everywhere, embedded in medical texts, royal chronicles, and farmers' almanacs. Even monks dabbled in it, usually between prayers, writing complaints about their joints, and quietly resenting cabbage. Let's not forget the astrological medical theories either. If an eclipse occurred in a sign connected to a particular body part, say, Virgo, which governs the stomach and digestive system, it was considered dangerous to treat illnesses of the bowels during that time. So yes, somewhere in Europe, a man is dying from diarrhea while a doctor refuses to treat him because the moon said no. You, however, have different concerns. You've just found out that your birth chart, which you were forced to reveal after a game of medieval truth or dare involving ale and turnip stew, marks you as afflicted by Mars during eclipses. This apparently means you're prone to anger, injury, and goat-related accidents. Which would be fine, except your neighbor just accused you of hexing his carrots. Now people are watching you differently. You feel it. A little too much eye contact. A little too much whispering. Someone drew a star symbol on your door, and not the good kind. You decide to do what any rational person in 1327 would do: burn some dried herbs, whisper a prayer to Saint Apollonia, and bury your birth chart in a dung heap. Problem solved. The funny thing is, or tragic, depending on your mood, astrology wasn't even entirely inaccurate by the standards of the time. People did notice real patterns. Eclipses did tend to cluster around important events. That's because they're cyclical and predictable, and if you live in a violent, unstable, disease-ridden world, pretty much everything feels apocalyptic anyway. So every eclipse is just confirmation of the chaos you already expect. It's like checking your horoscope and seeing you will experience conflict and discomfort today. Well, you're wearing wool underwear and eating spoiled turnips, so yes. Correct. So where does that leave you? Sitting in the dirt, watching a disgraced noble try to buy back his reputation with 3 chickens and a mildly poetic apology. The astrologer has disappeared, probably to the next town, where they'll claim to have predicted the great dung avalanche of 31 and be welcomed as a prophet. You sigh. The moon, once again, is normal. The stars are out. Nobody's screaming. For now. So you gather your things, walk home under the quiet night sky, and try not to think too hard about the fact that you live in a time when weather, death, and planetary motion are all considered personal attacks. The wind is soft. The night is calm. Your mattress still smells like betrayal. But you survived another chapter of medieval nonsense. Sleep tight. Just don't mention your moon sign to the neighbors. You wake up again. Not from the comfort of a featherbed. Not from the soothing embrace of high thread count linen sheets. No, you wake up because someone outside is ringing a bell and screaming the phrase, "The sky is falling," in Latin. Bad Latin. Peasant Latin. Which means it's either another plague, another tax, or, oh, lucky you, it's an eclipse again. Not another one, you think. But yes, this time it's a solar-lunar doubleheader. Think of it as the Super Bowl of medieval dread. Only instead of overpriced beer and halftime shows, you get famine, bloodletting, and a chronic distrust of shadows. You step outside in your stiff woolen shirt, rubbing your eyes with hands that haven't seen soap in 3 days. You look up, carefully avoiding the direct sunlight, because you've learned. The sky is a dull gray, and people are already in various stages of what fresh hell is this. A few are on their knees. One guy is kissing the ground, and another is making a circle of garlic around his mule. This is your life now. And this chapter is about how your ancestors, well-meaning, terrified bundles of lice and theological anxiety, decided that eclipses weren't just bad omens. Oh no, they were messages. Divine text messages. Apocalyptic sky faxes. And like most medieval messages, they were almost always misinterpreted in the worst way possible. Let's begin with one simple truth. Nobody agreed on what an eclipse meant. Ever. If the moon covered the sun and crops failed, it was a sign of God's wrath. If the moon covered the sun and someone was born with a 3rd nipple, it was witchcraft. If the moon covered the sun and nothing happened, clearly a warning of future doom. No matter what, something had to be wrong. You just had to dig hard enough to find the suffering. It's like medieval confirmation bias, but with way more burning torches. Take, for example, the Battle of the Eclipse in 585 BCE. Yes, technically this is pre-medieval, but stick with me, the vibes are very much the same. 2 armies, the Medes and the Lydians, were in the middle of a full-blown, stab-happy war, when a solar eclipse suddenly darkened the sky. Both sides dropped their weapons and immediately assumed the gods were giving them the silent treatment. So they made peace. Not out of reason, not out of diplomacy, but because the sun ghosted them. Fast forward to medieval Europe, and you'd think people might have built on that peaceful precedent. Nope, not even close. Let's go to the year 840, when Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne and part-time emotional wreck, saw a solar eclipse. According to the monk and part-time drama enthusiast Thegan of Trier, Louis took this as a sign that God was very disappointed in him, like a cosmic dad who just saw his report card. Louis panicked, tried to atone, and died soon after. Cause and effect? Coincidence? You be the judge. But once again, eclipses were blamed. Of course they were. Because medieval logic went something like this. Bad thing happens. Eclipses happened. Eclipses are scary. Therefore, eclipses cause bad things. That's airtight reasoning if you ignore everything science has ever said. And speaking of logic, let's talk about how the church handled eclipses. It's complicated. Some high-ranking clerics thought eclipses were natural and part of God's divine clockwork. Others thought they were Satan's little light show. It depended on who was pope, who was being excommunicated, and whether someone had recently been caught eating meat on a Friday. In fact, by the 12th century, church-approved chronicles were being published with full-on eclipse theories. Not helpful ones. Dramatic, doom-laden ones. Think, there shall be eclipses in the year of our Lord 1186, and these shall surely bring famine, pestilence, and unrest among the pagan Scots. You know, the usual. Oh, and speaking of 1186, what a year! That's when the grand conjunction of planets occurred alongside an eclipse, and everyone collectively lost it. Scholars across Europe predicted the world would end. Kings made penance. Peasants prayed themselves into dehydration. Merchants sold fake relics. People genuinely thought the apocalypse was knocking, and it was wearing a big celestial hat. Spoiler, it didn't happen. But the fear was real. Astrologers predicted the end. The church denied it. Peasants died anyway. Business as usual. Now, let's talk about the Crusades. Because if you want to weaponize an eclipse for maximum dramatic effect, you do it during a holy war. In 1096, during the People's Crusade, which is a nice way of saying a bunch of untrained religious zealots with pitchforks and enthusiasm, a lunar eclipse was interpreted as divine confirmation that their blood-soaked pilgrimage was totally justified. A red moon? Clearly God's way of saying, go forth and conquer. They did. It ended badly. You, meanwhile, are trying not to look at the sky. You've tied a rag around your eyes and are now cautiously navigating your village with the grace of a drunk raccoon. Why? Because your neighbor told you that looking directly at an eclipse will blind you and curse your cows. You only have one cow. You're not taking chances. But still, curiosity burns like a blister in your medieval soul. What is the sky doing up there? Let me describe it for you. The sunlight dims slowly. Birds go quiet. The breeze turns cold. Shadows begin to twist unnaturally, like the earth forgot how geometry works. And then, totality. The moon completely covers the sun. A black disk ringed by pale fire. It's breathtaking, terrifying, beautiful. And to you and your dirt-covered friends, it's almost certainly a warning. You hear someone mutter, a king will die. Another says, my cousin died last week, maybe this is just late. The village priest is reading a psalm about darkness while nervously eyeing the sky as if expecting it to fall on him. And just like that, you realize this moment, this bizarre, beautiful phenomenon, will now be remembered. Someone will write it down. A monk will document it. A bard will compose a sad little lute song. A noble will have it etched into his family tree, as the day his father saw the light extinguished and was thusly humbled. Because eclipses weren't just signs of events. They became events. They retroactively infected everything around them. If your harvest failed, it was the eclipse. If your daughter ran off with the blacksmith, eclipse. If you stubbed your toe on a crucifix during a night piss, probably the eclipse. There was no escaping it. That's the problem when the heavens are treated like Yelp reviews from God. Everything gets 5 stars in tragedy. Let's pause. Take a deep breath. Inhale the scent of soot, sheep, and subtle despair. Let your eyes grow heavy. Imagine that sky, dark, still, with stars peeking through in the middle of the day. Let the fear and superstition melt away. Because you, unlike your medieval peers, know the truth. You know that eclipses are just geometry, just shadows, just a dance of light and dark across cosmic space. But you also know they were history's favorite scapegoat. And in the world you live in, where people believe prayer can fix a broken leg and sneezing is suspicious, eclipses are about as welcome as a taxman with a leech jar. The eclipse fades. The light returns. Birds chirp. People emerge. The priest declares victory over darkness, even though he hid under a barrel. You survive. Again. You wake up at dawn. Again. But this time you're not afraid. You're confused. Because today, someone has told you, in a hushed, dramatic whisper, that the moon is going to eat the sun. On purpose. And a man with a feathered hat and a scroll has predicted the exact moment it will happen. Not because he's magical, not because he's holy, but because, allegedly, he did the math. Math? In this century? You're suspicious already. But still, you pull on your scratchy tunic, grab your satchel, which is really just a burlap sack with hopes and mildew, and head to the monastery where this mysterious calculation is about to unfold. Because today's chapter is about a strange moment in medieval history, the point where fear met curiosity, where superstition reluctantly shook hands with science, and where a bunch of nervous monks decided it was finally time to look at the sky on purpose. Welcome to the world of medieval eclipse prediction, a delicate balance of faith, numbers, and wildly inaccurate guesses involving animals. Let's set the scene. It's the 12th century. You live in a world where most people can't read, most diseases are blamed on wind, and the most reliable form of timekeeping is some guy yelling about shadows. And yet, here you are, standing in a candlelit scriptorium, watching a monk named Brother Ethelbert use a sharpened piece of charcoal to draw a suspiciously circular diagram of the universe. It looks a bit like a pizza, but instead of toppings, there are angels, stars, and something called the celestial spheres, which sound very impressive and vaguely threatening. And now, right next to this drawing, he begins to add numbers. Large ones, fractions, symbols. He is muttering in Latin and sweating profusely. You have no idea what he's doing, but he seems so confident. Here's the truth, medieval people were not stupid. They were just working with bad data, inconsistent tools, and a few centuries of divine terror weighing them down like a cursed tunic. They were desperate to understand the cosmos, not just because it was beautiful, but because it seemed personal. The sky didn't just move, it spoke, and eclipses were its exclamation points. The early attempts to predict eclipses in Europe were borrowed, as most things were, from older, better-equipped civilizations. Ancient Babylonians, Greeks, and Islamic scholars had already noticed patterns, the famous Sarah cycle, for example. It's about 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours long, roughly the time between two eclipses that repeat in nearly the same geometry. They tracked it using clay tablets, star charts, and minds unburdened by Gregorian bureaucracy. The problem? Western Europe had lost most of that knowledge. The Roman Empire fell, libraries burned, and suddenly Europe was left trying to rebuild the science of the heavens using only Bible verses, a half-eaten astrolabe, and vibes. But by the 12th century, things started to change. Slowly, painfully, in a haze of dust, ink, and very bad eyesight. Thanks in part to the translation movement in Spain, where Arabic texts were being painstakingly converted into Latin, European scholars were suddenly hit with a wave of ancient astronomical knowledge. It was like giving a calculator to someone who had just spent their life counting on goat bones. These texts included the works of Ptolemy, Al-Batani, and Al-Zarqali, men who had actually observed the stars without assuming each one was the eye of judgment. And so, in dusty monasteries and universities that smelled faintly of cheese and candle smoke, European scholars began to try their hand at calculating eclipses. And I mean try. Because here's how you would do it, in theory. First, calculate the positions of the sun and moon. Then, determine when their paths intersect on the celestial sphere. After that, use a series of complex time cycles, lunar months, solar years, the aforementioned Saras, to project when the next alignment will occur. Then you triple-check your numbers, cry a little, and guess. Now, this is all assuming you had access to accurate timekeeping, good observational data, any understanding of orbital mechanics. But of course, you had none of those things. Your sundial barely worked. Your clock tower was probably wrong. And your moon tables were copied by a monk who once confused Jupiter for a pigeon. So, the accuracy was flexible. Still, predictions were made. Some were astonishingly close. Others were not. Like the time an eclipse was predicted to occur on the 3rd of April in the year 1191, and nothing happened. The monk responsible simply wrote in the margins, "It was cloudy." A fair defense. But here's the wild part. Despite the uncertainty, people still believed them. Because if you could even sort of predict an eclipse, you were seen as powerful, almost divine. Kings kept court astrologers. Scholars earned fame. And villagers gathered in silence, staring up at the sky, waiting to see if the stars obeyed the scribbled prophecies of some exhausted man in a robe. You're still in the scriptorium, By the way, watching Brother Ethelbert proudly present his prediction, an eclipse is coming tonight. He's got diagrams. He's got parchment. He's got a glassy look in his eyes that suggests either divine inspiration or serious dehydration. And now the village is buzzing. People are making protective charms. The priest is preparing a sermon titled, "On the Occasion of the Sun's Temporary Defeat by Moonly Sin." And one woman has decided to put a colander on her head for safety. The sun begins to set. The villagers gather on the hillside. And the moment comes. The moon inches across the sky. A black crescent creeps into the sun's light. It's happening. The eclipse begins. A cheer goes up. Then silence. Then panic. Because nobody ever reacts calmly to a prophecy coming true. Some fall to their knees. Some start confessing wildly inappropriate things. Someone throws a chicken at the sky, just in case. Brother Ethelbert is weeping with joy. The priest is offended. A man next to you has wet himself and is now praying into a handful of grass. It's beautiful. It's chaos. And it's surprisingly accurate. Because for once, someone got it right. For a brief moment, the medieval world touches something beyond fear. Something like awe, wonder, the sense that maybe the universe can be understood. That maybe we're not just damp meatbags fumbling in the dark, maybe we can read the stars. Then the moment passes. The moon moves on. The sun returns. And the villagers go back to yelling about goats. You walk home in the soft glow of evening. The prediction was right. The world did not end. No one died, unless you count the chicken. And for once, you feel strangely proud. Not because you understand astronomy. You absolutely don't. But because someone did. And they shared it. With ink. And math. And a deeply questionable understanding of planetary orbits. As you lie on your straw mattress, drifting into sleep, you smile. Tomorrow, you'll forget most of this. You'll go back to worrying about crop rot and your cousin's mysterious rash. But tonight, you witnessed a medieval miracle. A man did math, and it worked. Sleep now. Rest easy. Because the next eclipse is only 18 years away, and you're statistically unlikely to survive that long anyway. You wake up to the sound of wailing. Again. Not because someone's being robbed. Not because a cow gave birth to a chicken again. But because last night, the sky went dark and now half the village is convinced their souls are inside out. Welcome to post-eclipse Europe, a place where nothing makes sense and everyone is suddenly an expert on the humors. You shuffle out of bed, dragging your itchy blanket turn shawl behind you like a depressed wizard. The air smells like boiled cabbage, sheep sweat, and fear. The eclipse is over, but the trauma lingers. Because in the medieval world, the real danger of an eclipse wasn't the astronomical event itself, it was what came after. The rumors, the panic, the treatments. This chapter is about what people did after an eclipse, when their brains were fried from fear and their worldview had been aggressively moonslapped. And like everything else in medieval life, the answer was usually, get weird. Let's begin with the concept of celestial residue. Yes, you read that right. Many people in medieval Europe believed that during an eclipse, something happened to the air, that it got contaminated, corrupted, or morally compromised. The idea was that the darkness somehow infected the atmosphere with cosmic toxins. Think of it like evil radiation, but instead of causing cancer, it made you sinful, unlucky, or just extremely annoying. So what do? When the sky gives you invisible evil particles, you treat it, of course, with air purification rituals. One of the more popular methods involved waving burning herbs around your home, especially mugwort, rosemary, and sometimes, if you were really rich and desperately out of ideas, imported cinnamon. This wasn't for fragrance. It was to cleanse the ether. You were basically doing a medieval version of burning sage, but with the added fear that if you inhaled wrong, a demon might crawl into your spleen. For the poor, the solution was simpler, onions. You'd hang them above your door, tie them to your clothes, or if you were especially superstitious, shove one in your mouth and just leave it there. Why? Because onions were thought to absorb evil vapors. They were like spiritual Roombas, except they made your breath smell like sadness. If you were a farmer, you had a very specific post-eclipse checklist. Check livestock for signs of corruption. If your pig looks at you funny, it might be cursed. Sprinkle blessed salt in the stables. If the animal eats it and dies, it was already doomed. You're off the hook. Do not, under any circumstances, plant seeds for 3 days. The earth is recovering from a trauma. Now let's move on to the real treatment plans, the ones meant for people. Because if you, as a medieval human, experience fear, nausea, or any unexplained emotion during an eclipse, that was a medical emergency. You were probably out of balance. The sky had unhinged your humors. Your bile was almost certainly doing something rude. The cures varied. If you were wealthy, a physician would bleed you. Naturally. Because why not reduce your ability to survive stress by removing blood? It's science. Sort of. If you were average, the town healer might give you a tincture made of crushed rose petals, honey, and powdered unicorn horn, which was usually just powdered narwhal tusk sold by a guy named Alan who definitely wasn't a wizard but charged like one. And if you were dirt poor, like sleep in the barn poor, then your options were more improvisational. Some villages believed walking backward through a field of barley would undo the eclipse's damage to your soul. Others prescribed sitting silently in a cellar with a horseshoe tied around your neck and a prayer to Saint Agatha, the patron saint of, among other things, breast-related disasters. It's unclear why she was involved in eclipse trauma, but you don't ask questions in a world where shadows are suspicious. But by far the strangest treatment? Iron shoes. There was a belief, especially in parts of Eastern Europe and the Holy Roman Empire, that wearing iron on your feet after an eclipse would ground the celestial energy and prevent madness. So yes, you would strap metal plates to your feet and stomp around like a medieval Frankenstein, hoping the moon would lose interest in your brain. The results were, predictably, a disaster. People broke toes, slipped on mud. One monk reportedly lost a nail and blamed it on Satan's pull. And while we're here, let's address pregnancy. Oh boy. Nothing freaked medieval people out more than a pregnant woman during an eclipse. The idea was that the darkened sky could warp a fetus, not in a metaphorical way, but in a your baby might be born with a tail sort of way. Some texts recommended placing knives or scissors near the belly to cut the influence of the eclipse. This is not a joke. People put sharp metal objects near pregnant women to protect the baby from moon cooties. Others suggested tying red ribbons around the mother's wrists, ankles, and forehead, forming what was essentially a sacred medieval panic outfit. Midwives were instructed to shield pregnant women with cloaks, lock them indoors, and chant prayers in a specific pattern while shaking holy water. If you lived through all of that and still had a healthy birth, it was considered proof that the baby had a destiny. Or at least wouldn't be cursed. You, meanwhile, have none of these problems. You're just a tired peasant whose neighbor is currently eating clay to absorb the eclipse's poison. You wave at him. He waves back. His teeth are now brown. Good times. At the castle, assuming you live near one, the nobility are handling things differently. Their doctors have recommended drinking wine infused with crushed emerald and eating purified goose eggs. They're fine. They always are. Their main concern is whether the next eclipse will interfere with the archery tournament or make their favorite falcon go blind. Back in the village, the priest has taken a different approach. He's blaming everyone. Sin brought the eclipse, he says. Lust, gambling, dancing, Jews, heretics, sarcastic peasants, that's probably you. He suggested a week of fasting, daily lashings, and no more public singing. At all. You pretend to agree and then immediately go home and hum a dirty song while rubbing onions on your door. And now, let's talk about the people who claimed they liked eclipses. Yes, they existed. Some medieval philosophers and mystics saw eclipses as moments of divine insight, brief windows where the veil of reality thinned and humanity could glimpse the true nature of the cosmos. These people were usually weird, barefoot, and covered in soot, but occasionally brilliant. One such man, a hermit named Alfric of Wensleydale, claimed that eclipses were a form of divine blinking, God briefly closing his eyes to give the world a moment to reflect. He then suggested everyone reflect by eating mushrooms, staring into wells, and talking to birds. He died of bad mushrooms. But he was onto something. Because eclipses did inspire wonder. Terror, yes. Confusion, often. But also curiosity. They broke the monotony. They reminded people that the sky was still a thing of mystery, that no matter how many turnips you harvested, there were still questions you couldn't answer. Not yet. As you lie down again, your mattress still smells faintly of goat and defeat. You think about the moon. You don't understand it. You probably never will. But for one night, the whole village looked up together. And afterward, they got weird together. Screamed, prayed, cried, ate herbs, bled themselves, hugged their chickens, and somehow survived. Sleep now. You've earned it. Because the next eclipse won't be for another 20 years. You wake up in a bed that isn't yours. It smells clean, which is suspicious. There are no chickens in the room, no damp straw, no neighbor muttering about the moon outside your window. Instead, there's a thick mattress stuffed with actual wool, a wooden chair that doesn't wobble, and a carved table with actual legs and no wormholes. You've been kidnapped, or promoted, or both. Because today, for reasons you don't entirely understand, you're in a castle. And not the dungeon part, the nice part. Why? Because you said something vaguely smart about an eclipse last week and someone important overheard you. And now, you've been summoned to court. Not to be executed, which was your first guess, but to advise the crown, which is worse. Because the king has a plan. And it's insane. He wants to use an eclipse, not just watch it, not just fear it, but weaponize it. Turn it into a political event. This isn't a joke. This chapter is about the long, strange history of people using eclipses to gain power. Whether it was scaring peasants into submission, dazzling nobles with fake astrology, or convincing entire armies to surrender because the gods are clearly on our side, eclipses have been medieval humanity's most underrated political tool. Let's start with something simple: timing. In the Middle Ages, timing was everything. If you wanted to launch a war, crown a king, or fire a bishop for unholy flatulence, you needed a sign from heaven. And there was nothing more theatrical than an eclipse. Now, predicting eclipses accurately was rare, but not impossible. And the moment someone figured out how to sort of get it right, they realized they could suddenly sound very, very impressive. Take Michael Scott, for example. Yes, that was his real name. No, he wasn't from Scranton. Michael Scott was a 13th century scholar, court astrologer, and low-key terrifying polymath who worked for Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II. He translated Arabic texts, studied the stars, and reportedly could call down fire from heaven, which probably just meant he had matches and charisma. Michael predicted eclipses accurately, and he used them to make himself indispensable. When an eclipse was coming, he'd whisper it to the emperor days in advance, casually, like it wasn't a big deal. Then, when the sky darkened, people lost their minds, and Michael calmly reminded everyone that he called it. This made him look not just smart, but almost supernatural. It's like calling a power outage in advance, then casually pulling out a flashlight and offering leadership. Everyone assumes you're either a prophet or a wizard. In truth, Michael just had better books than most people. But let's go further back, to a time when predictions weren't necessary. Just knowing when an eclipse would happen was enough. Consider King Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne. In 840 CE, there was a total solar eclipse. Right after it, his nobles started rebelling. They took it as a literal sign that the divine order was breaking down. Louis, who was already in poor health, took the eclipse as a bad omen. He panicked. He tried to make peace with his rebellious sons, and, in doing so, destabilized his own empire. An eclipse didn't kill his rule, but it sure helped push it off a cliff. Meanwhile, other rulers leaned into it. In 1033, there was an annular eclipse. You know, the kind where the moon covers the sun's center and creates the dramatic ring of fire. It just so happened to coincide with the 1000th anniversary of Christ's death, according to medieval math. So, naturally, many Europeans assumed the end of the world was nigh. One minor noble in northern Italy used the eclipse hysteria to declare himself the new Messiah. He wore a robe made of silver, claimed he had divine visions, and started taxing people in the name of the second coming. This lasted exactly 5 weeks before someone hit him with a shovel. But for a brief moment, he ruled. And what about clerics with ambition? They loved eclipses. Bishops and abbots would often interpret an eclipse as a sign that God was angry at the current leadership, conveniently just before lobbying for a new tax, a new war, or a new church being built right next to their childhood home. There's one documented case in 1178 where a group of monks in Canterbury used a lunar eclipse to argue that the local lord was a heretic. Why? Because the moon turned red the same week he refused to donate a vineyard. Coincidence? Definitely. But try arguing with monks in robes while your peasants are whispering about blood moons and devil babies. Spoiler, the monks won the vineyard. Now back to you. You're still in the castle. The king is pacing, nervously tugging at his beard, which has more oil in it than a bakery chimney. He's planning an announcement, something grand. He wants to declare that the upcoming eclipse is proof of his divine right to rule. That God himself is dimming the sun in deference to the crown. You, the accidental court eclipse guy, are supposed to confirm this. Publicly. You think about refusing. Then you remember that people who disappoint kings usually get promoted to corpse. So you nod. Gravely. Mysteriously. You add a few Latin phrases you don't fully understand. You draw a diagram with lines and moons and arrows. Nobody knows what it means, but everyone claps anyway. The announcement is made. The eclipse comes. And it's perfect. The sky darkens. The birds go quiet. The peasants scream. And there stands the king, arms outstretched, bathed in the eerie twilight, looking extremely smug. It works. For now. But remember, eclipses giveth and taketh away. Another one might come. And it might favor someone else. Because the sky doesn't care about your power struggles. It just does things. And we interpret them. Badly. Elsewhere in history, we see similar stories play out. In the Islamic world, the eclipse of 632 coincided with the death of the Prophet Muhammad's son. People immediately began to whisper that the heavens were mourning. But the Prophet himself rejected the idea. He declared that eclipses were signs of God's majesty, not personal omens, a remarkably scientific stance, especially in the 7th century. Meanwhile, in China, as we mentioned earlier, failing to predict an eclipse could get you beheaded. But accurately doing it? That could make you legendary. In 213 BCE, 2 Chinese astrologers predicted an eclipse so accurately that the emperor gave them a bonus year of life. Literally. He rewrote their birth records. Which, in bureaucratic terms, is the most romantic thing you can do. So yes, eclipses were useful. 4 tyrants. 4 scholars. 4 con artists. You've now returned home, richer, more famous, and only slightly traumatized. You've tasted power. You've seen what fear can do. And you've also learned that the sky doesn't belong to kings, or monks, or people who think the moon is made of cheese. It just keeps moving. Quietly. Indifferently. And sometimes, that's the most humbling thing of all. Sleep now. You wake up in church. Not because you chose to be here. You were dragged in, gently, but firmly, by a nun who smelled like candle wax, old bread, and quiet authority. She muttered something about your eternal soul and sky crimes, and now you're kneeling on a stone floor while a priest lectures the entire village about the dangers of looking up without permission. Welcome to medieval theology, where the heavens are sacred territory, eclipses are not your business, and curiosity is a sin if you weren't ordained by someone who wears a pointy hat and speaks exclusively in terrified Latin. This chapter is about the church. Specifically, how it responded to eclipses, and what that response says about power, fear, and the medieval obsession with making sure nobody asked too many questions about the sky. Spoiler, if you were a curious peasant with a telescope-shaped stick and a few too many thoughts about orbital mechanics, things didn't usually go well for you. Let's start with the basics. The medieval church didn't hate astronomy. Not exactly. In fact, monks and clergy were some of the most educated people in Europe, and many studied the stars quite seriously. They charted eclipses, mapped planetary movements, and copied ancient manuscripts with trembling hands and ink made from oak galls and crush bugs. But here's the catch. The church didn't fear astronomy. They feared astrology. And in medieval Europe, those two things were like conjoined twins in a bad marriage. No one could tell where one ended and the other began, but everyone blamed both when things went wrong. To the average person in the 12th century, looking at the sky was fine, as long as you didn't suggest it meant something. The moment you said, "This eclipse is a sign," you were treading dangerously close to heresy, especially if that sign wasn't repent and go to Mass more often. The official church line on eclipses was, predictably, theologically complex and emotionally confusing. They were, in theory, natural phenomena. God made the world with order. Eclipses happened because the moon passed in front of the sun, or the earth passed in front of the moon. This was divine precision, not chaos. But also, eclipses were spiritual warnings, and sometimes punishments, and occasionally tests of faith, designed to see who would panic and accidentally confess to owning dice. In short, eclipses were whatever the church needed them to be, whenever it needed them to be that thing. Like theological duct tape, but with more incense. You, of course, don't understand any of this. Because your job involves mud and sheep, not metaphysics. So you sit on the cold stone floor, shivering under your only shirt, listening to Father Benedict explain how the eclipse that happened 2 weeks ago is a clear sign that the local well is cursed and also that someone here has been reading books they shouldn't have. The room gets very quiet. Everyone thinks of you. Why? Because last year, you accidentally called the moon a cold rock at the tavern. And now people think you're the reason 3 goats have gone cross-eyed. Congratulations. You're now astronomically suspicious. Let's rewind. In the early medieval period, think 500s to 900s, the church was still figuring itself out. Christianity had spread across Europe, often by absorbing local pagan traditions, like a sponge soaked in superstition. Eclipses, being big and dramatic and terrifying, were a theological headache. Pagan peoples, Saxons, Gauls, early Slavs, had long believed that eclipses were caused by monsters or demons devouring the sun or moon. These beliefs were sticky. They clung to people's brains like dried honey on a tunic. The church didn't want people howling and banging drums every time the moon vanished. That was pagan nonsense. So what did they do? They rebranded eclipses. Instead of being caused by sky beasts, eclipses were now signs of divine will, warnings, heavenly nudges, cosmic sermons without the confusing bits. They weren't caused by dragons. They were caused by sin, your sin. And the timing? Always suspiciously aligned with local problems. Plague outbreak? Clearly foretold by last month's eclipse. Bad harvest? The moon warned you, but you didn't listen. Baron got hit by a falling rock? Definitely divine punishment for not donating more to the cathedral roof fund. The clergy became extremely good at using celestial events to reinforce authority. If you wanted answers, you went to the church, not the local scholar, not the village weirdo with a sun chart carved into a piece of bone, not the traveling merchant who claimed to have seen an eclipse once and now calls himself the sky prophet. Just the church. Because if you got your information from anyone else, you risked heresy. And heresy, in the Middle Ages, was not treated like a bad opinion. It was treated like cosmic treason. Ask Giordano Bruno. Well, don't. He's very dead. Burned at the stake in 1600 for a variety of theological crimes, one of which involved suggesting that the stars were suns and that other worlds might exist, and, a horror of horrors, that the universe didn't revolve around Earth. Bruno lived in the Renaissance, not the Middle Ages, but his fate was a chilling echo of what the medieval church would have done to anyone who got too curious about the sky. And speaking of heresy, let's talk about Pope Calixtus III. In 1456, still medievalish, don't nitpick, the Pope issued a papal bull against Halley's Comet, which was terrifying Europe by hovering ominously while the Ottomans were storming Belgrade. According to some sources, he tried to excommunicate the comet. Yes, the church tried to fire a heavenly object. Historians debate whether this actually happened or whether it was just an enthusiastic misinterpretation by panicked clergy. But the point stands, celestial phenomena were serious business. The sky was not neutral. It had meaning. And you were not qualified to interpret that meaning unless you wore a robe and had a very fancy ring. By the High Middle Ages, 1100 to 1300, universities were starting to form. Monks like Bede the Venerable and later Albertus Magnus wrote extensively on astronomy. They knew eclipses were predictable. They even calculated them, to a degree. But that knowledge was controlled, taught in Latin, kept in cloisters, shared in close circles. Because an informed populace is great unless they start asking questions like, if God made the heavens predictable, maybe we can figure them out ourselves. Or worse, maybe we don't need priests to explain the moon. And that's dangerous talk. So, you, dear villager, are told the following. Do not stare at eclipses unless supervised by a priest. Do not interpret eclipses unless you've read the Bible 3 times and fasted for a week. Do not discuss eclipses if your neighbor is already nervous about their chickens. And above all, do not write anything down. Inquisitors love written confessions. And speaking of inquisitors, they were especially twitchy about astronomy, because it was often tangled up with magic. You see, in medieval minds, stargazing was a slippery slope. First you chart the moon. Then you guess someone's fate based on it. Then you draw a circle in chalk and summon something with wings and a lot of opinions. And next thing you know, you're naked in the woods trying to control the weather with a bone flute. So best to nip that in the bud. The church's fear of eclipses was really a fear of independent knowledge. They weren't scared of the sun going dark. They were scared of you understanding why. Because if you could predict an eclipse, what else could you predict? A storm? A drought? The outcome of a war? Maybe even the end of the world? Yes, that was another major issue. Apocalyptic predictions. Eclipses were often tied to eschatology, the study of end times. Several chroniclers noted that when the moon turned red, a lunar eclipse, villagers would assume Judgment Day was around the corner. Some would panic and confess to things they hadn't even done, just in case. One woman famously confessed to knitting too violently, which remains one of the more creative sins in medieval records. And yet, amid all this fear, there were glimmers of curiosity. Monks who charted eclipses out of genuine wonder. Scholars who whispered theories late at night in freezing scriptoria. Peasants who looked up at the sky and wondered, quietly, if maybe the world was bigger than they'd been told. You might be one of those peasants. And yes, you still smell faintly of sheep. But tonight, as you lie back on a lumpy mattress in a smoky hut with a leaky roof and a single rat named Cheddar, you think about the moon. And not with fear, but with curiosity. Because maybe, just maybe, there's something up there worth understanding. Sleep now. You've survived theology. You wake up to screaming. Not your own, this time. That's an improvement. It's the village elder. He's outside, waving a ladle at the sky and yelling something about the great celestial dog returning for its moo meat. A child runs past you holding a pot, banging it furiously with a spoon. Someone else is throwing dried peas into a fire for reasons you can't quite follow. You, bleary-eyed and still wrapped in a blanket that smells like boiled turnip and despair, shuffle outside just in time to see the moon vanish, slowly, steadily, as though someone is chewing on it from the left side. Which, according to local legend, is exactly what's happening. Welcome to the world of medieval eclipse folklore, where the only thing more unpredictable than the sun is people's imaginations. This is not a time for telescopes or rational thought. This is a time for screaming, rattling, praying, and occasionally, interpretive dancing. In this chapter, we'll be exploring the weird, the wonderful, and the wildly incorrect things people believed about eclipses, not because they were stupid, but because when the moon disappears and you have no access to science, you come up with something, preferably involving animals, possibly involving demons. Let's begin with a classic, the sky dog theory. Popular in China, parts of Eastern Europe, and anywhere that someone had ever seen a wolf and thought, what if that, but bigger and in the sky, this idea was simple. Eclipses happen because a giant dog, not a metaphorical dog, mind you, a real, furry, possibly slobbery celestial mutt, tries to eat the moon. You can't blame people. Imagine you're a farmer in 842 AD. You've just buried half your wheat because of blight, your goats are acting suspicious, and now, in the middle of the night, the full moon, your only source of light, guidance, and vague romantic optimism, starts to vanish. It doesn't blink out. It's eaten, bite by bite. Clearly, the solution is to make as much noise as possible to scare off the cosmic canine. This is why, during eclipses, entire villages would bang drums, clang pots, light fires, and, in some places, throw feces into the air. It was loud. It was smelly. And most importantly, it worked every time. Why? Because the moon always came back. You may recognize this as the post hoc fallacy, but medieval peasants recognized it as proof of strategy. If screaming and banging a spoon against a barrel worked once, you did it every time. In fact, not doing it felt irresponsible. What if the dog decided to finish the job? In Vietnam, the culprit wasn't a dog, but a giant frog. A big, hungry, cosmic amphibian, who, despite no confirmed history of lunar consumption, was somehow blamed for every lunar eclipse. The logic was riveting. And no, they weren't being metaphorical. They genuinely believed a sky frog was responsible. The proper response was, again, noise, racket, uproar. Humans, it turns out, have always believed that loud chaos is the best way to fix things we don't understand. Elsewhere, in parts of India and Nepal, the story involved Rahu, a disembodied head from Hindu mythology who tried to steal immortality, got decapitated for his trouble, and now roams the sky, eternally chasing the sun and moon to exact his revenge. When he catches them, we get an eclipse. When he swallows them, they disappear briefly before sliding out the back of his neck, because apparently Rahu never digested his victims. He was a cosmic head, not a digestive system. Now, unlike Europe's celestial mutts, Rahu was part of an actual cosmological system. The Hindu understanding of astronomy was surprisingly advanced, with mathematical models and eclipse prediction tables that would make your average medieval monk weep into his unreliable sundial. But even so, people didn't like eclipses. In some places, pregnant women were told not to go outside during a lunar eclipse for fear it would curse the unborn child. Others bathed after an eclipse to wash off bad energy. Livestock was hidden, food was covered, and in some homes they just sat still, quiet, waiting for the sky to fix itself. Meanwhile, the Norse, being the Norse, had a story that made everyone else's look like a bedtime tale. According to Viking legend, the sun and the moon were pursued through the sky by two wolves, Skoll and Hati, whose names roughly translate to treachery and hate. These wolves weren't interested in fetch or belly rubs. They were chasing the sun and moon to devour them. Eclipses happened when they got close. And the end of the world, Ragnarok, would happen when they finally succeeded. You can see why Norsemen were a little twitchy during solar events. Back in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs took things a step further. They believed that eclipses were signs of divine imbalance, times when the cosmic forces that govern the universe slipped out of alignment. In one particularly cheerful version of the story, an eclipse meant that a jaguar was eating the moon, and if people weren't careful, that jaguar might come down to eat them. 2. The proper response? Human sacrifice, preferably involving warriors or captives. Because if you want the moon to stop bleeding, obviously you need to kill someone. For the Aztecs, this wasn't panic. It was policy. The celestial order had to be maintained, and if a little bloodshed was required to keep the jaguar satisfied, well, it was Tuesday anyway. Compare this to medieval Europe, where sacrifice wasn't usually required, but fear absolutely was. Remember, most people in the medieval world couldn't read, didn't travel, and had never seen more than a few dozen people in their entire lives. So when the sky, their only clock, calendar, and celestial friend, turned red or vanished entirely, it wasn't just unsettling. It was existential. Your average peasant believed the sun and moon were alive. Maybe not with personalities, but with meaning. The sky wasn't a machine. It was a story, and you were a background character. When the sun disappeared, it wasn't a physics problem. It was a moral one. What did we do wrong? Who offended the heavens? Was it me? Was it Jeff? It's probably Jeff. No one likes Jeff. This is why, even in places that had accurate mathematical models for eclipses, places like Baghdad during the Islamic Golden Age or the monastic centers of Ireland, the average person still responded to an eclipse like it was the opening scene of a disaster film. The noise-making tradition persisted across cultures, across continents, and across common sense. China, Mongolia, India, the Balkans, even parts of sub-Saharan Africa, they all had some version of the bang pots to save the moon strategy. And if that didn't work, offerings. In some parts of Africa, people would throw spears or arrows toward the sky during an eclipse, hoping to drive away the creature or spirit responsible. In others, they'd offer food, drink, or blood, not as a bribe, but as a cosmic apology. In Peru, the Inca viewed eclipses with reverent dread. They believed the sun god Inti was displeased when eclipses occurred, and thus sacrifices, usually animals, sometimes humans, were made to restore his favor. Again, this wasn't mindless terror. This was cultural protocol. You, back in your own village, aren't offering anything. You're just hiding under a pile of turnips and wondering how it all went so wrong. But not everyone panicked. There were scattered throughout the centuries, people who saw eclipses as beautiful, as natural, as rare chances to witness the clockwork of the cosmos. In Japan, noblewomen wrote poetry about eclipses. In some African tribes, elders taught children to be still and watch silently as a way to honor the sky. And in isolated pockets of the medieval world, people began to suspect that maybe, just maybe, this happens on a schedule. But those were outliers. For the majority of medieval humanity, an eclipse was a cosmic crime scene. No matter where you lived, there was probably a creature to blame. A myth, a chant, a ritual, a thing you had to do immediately to keep the world from unraveling. And if it worked, you thanked the gods. If it didn't, you blamed Jeff. Still not liking Jeff. So here we are, back in your cold little hut, hiding from the sky, clutching a piece of stale bread and praying the sun comes back before your goat gets any weirder. Outside, the villagers are singing. Inside, you wonder what it all means. And somewhere, far above you, the moon emerges from the earth's shadow, slowly, quietly, as if it had never left at all. You wake up in a library. Well, it's not quite a library. It's more like a dusty room full of stone tablets and grumpy scholars. There's a man in the corner carving cuneiform into clay with a kind of intensity normally reserved for tax season. Someone else is arguing about lunar cycles using a stick and a goat bladder. You're not entirely sure if this is a study group or a cult. Congratulations. You're in Babylonia, roughly 600 BCE. You're barefoot, illiterate, and you just accidentally wandered into one of the earliest known centers of astronomical prediction. And what are they doing in this hot, chalky room full of stale beer fumes and irritated scribes? They're figuring out the pattern behind eclipses. Because while most of the ancient world was busy blaming werewolves, dragons, and the divine equivalent of moody lighting technicians, the Babylonians were staring at the sky, writing things down, and noticing something wild. The moon keeps disappearing on a schedule. This chapter is about those people, the nerds, the scribes, the early data hoarders, the ones who saw the apocalypse happen in the sky, and instead of running for a pot to bang, they reached for a stylus. So let's rewind a little. The Babylonians were the kind of people who made Excel sheets out of stars. They observed the heavens obsessively. Like, no, I cannot come to your wedding. I'm busy watching the moon again obsessively. They didn't just track eclipses. They tracked the color of eclipses, the time of night they happened, the position of the stars nearby, how long they lasted, and how many goats gave birth around the same time. You know, just in case. Now, they didn't have algebra, or geometry, or science in the way we think about it today. But they had patterns. And by the 7th century BCE, these early astronomers had discovered something called the Saros cycle, a period of roughly 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours after which lunar and solar eclipses repeat, almost identically. Let me say that again. Without telescopes, without calculators, and definitely without caffeine pills, the Babylonians figured out that eclipses are cyclical. You can literally predict the next one, almost to the day, by counting forward 18 years, 11 days, and 8 hours. This was both revolutionary and terrifying. Imagine being a king, and your astrologer shows up like, "Hey, sire, I've done some math on this clay. The moon's gonna disappear again next spring. Don't worry, it's a normal event." That's power. That's divine power disguised as math. The Saros cycle isn't a small achievement. It's a data project that requires centuries of careful observation. Think about that. Hundreds of scribes across generations had to care enough to keep watching, writing, passing notes, and somehow not setting the records on fire when they got bored or conquered. So yes, shout out to the Babylonians, the original eclipse analysts, the I told you so squad of the ancient world. But now let's talk about the Greeks, because of course the Greeks show up and make it weird. You're in ancient Greece now. You've teleported again. Don't ask how. Your blanket still smells like pickled olives and disappointment. You're in a shaded courtyard where a man with a beard so large it has its own postal code is lecturing a group of bored students about celestial spheres. His name? Anaxagoras. His vibe? I'm smarter than you, and I know it. Anaxagoras is the first guy, as far as we know, to publicly say that eclipses aren't caused by angry gods or hungry sky dogs. Nope. According to Anaxagoras, the moon is a rock. The sun is a fireball. And eclipses are just shadows. Let's pause here. Imagine being a religious authority in 5th century BCE Athens, and this philosopher, who looks like he hasn't washed in a decade, stands up and says, "The moon is not a deity. It's just a reflective lump of dirt." You'd be furious. And many people were. Anaxagoras was nearly exiled for saying this stuff out loud. But in his defense, he was right. He argued that a solar eclipse happens when the moon passes in front of the sun, and a lunar eclipse when Earth's shadow hits the moon. In other words, basic celestial geometry. Still, nobody liked hearing that their moon goddess was just a cold, pockmarked space potato. Especially not after centuries of poetry, worship, and deeply emotional rituals involving goats. After Anaxagoras came a man named Aristarchus, who not only doubled down on the moon as a rock theory, but casually added, also, the sun is really far away, and we all orbit around it. He was laughed out of existence. We wouldn't get back to that idea for nearly 2,000 years, because if there's one thing humanity is good at, it's ignoring perfectly good science until it's politically convenient. But back to eclipses. By the time you get to Hipparchus, another Greek and a real spreadsheet kind of guy, things are looking much more scientific. Hipparchus lived in the 2nd century BCE and created some of the most accurate star maps in antiquity. He also calculated the distance to the moon using eclipse geometry and was only off by about 10%. That's right. No calculators. No telescopes. Just shadows, timing, and math. And he still got closer than your average YouTube commenter. Hipparchus even figured out the eccentricity of the moon's orbit, which is a fancy way of saying it's not a perfect circle. Deal with it. Why does this matter? Because once you know the shape of the orbit and the pattern of shadows, you can predict eclipses without having to ask a priest or consult your neighbor's hallucinating uncle. Which brings us, reluctantly, to the most smug of all the Greeks, Claudius Ptolemy. Ptolemy lived in Alexandria around 150 CE and decided to write a book. A very long book. A book so detailed and convoluted that it was essentially the Wikipedia of astronomy for the next 1,000 years. This book, the Almagest, compiled eclipse data, star charts, and a full planetary system, all based on the idea that Earth was the center of everything. Wrong? Yes. Useful? Also yes. Ptolemy's models could predict eclipses with decent accuracy, even if the reasoning behind them was completely off. His math worked. His assumptions didn't. But in a world that still burned people for thinking out loud, that was close enough. Fast forward to the Islamic Golden Age, Baghdad, 9th century CE. You're now sipping lukewarm tea in the House of Wisdom, a kind of mega-library where scholars translated Greek texts into Arabic, corrected them, and then made new discoveries that the Greeks couldn't even dream of. Astronomers like al-Battani, al-Zarqali, and al-Biruni refined eclipse predictions using trigonometry, a tool that hadn't really existed back when the Greeks were eyeballing moon angles. They mapped lunar nodes, calculated eclipse paths, and even started estimating planetary sizes based on eclipse shadowing. You want precision? These guys were calculating the latitude impact of an eclipse, which basically means they could tell where on Earth it would be visible. Not just when, but where. They were also the first to suggest that the Earth might rotate on its axis, which, again, was ignored by most people for centuries because heaven forbid the ground move. And here's the kicker. The European scholars who later rediscovered this knowledge during the Renaissance, they got it from Arabic texts. That's right. Your favorite bearded Renaissance polymath was probably just translating someone else's homework from Baghdad. But back in medieval Europe, well, let's just say math wasn't exactly trending. In the 13th century, monks were still debating whether or not an eclipse was a sign that God was annoyed about dancing or possibly theater. And when people like Roger Bacon or Thomas Aquinas tried to suggest otherwise, they had to wrap it in a lot of theology just to avoid being accused of heresy. Meanwhile, your average peasant? Still banging pots. So what have we learned? That while the world screamed and prayed, a small group of patient, sleep-deprived men in dusty robes were watching the sky. Counting. Writing. Comparing notes. Getting it wrong. Getting it slightly less wrong. And eventually, getting it almost right. They were astronomers. They were astrologers. They were math nerds with candle burns on their robes and poor social skills. And they figured it out. Not because they were smarter, but because they were obsessed. Because they wanted to understand why the moon vanished. Why the sun went dark. Why the sky changed, not just randomly, but predictably. They didn't have iPads. They had chalk, clay, geometry, and time. And somehow, they gave us a tool to look into the future.